Okay, so we're going to analyze some sources together. We're on page 420 in the textbook. A Manifest Destiny. Westward expansion of the United States was carried out by diplomacy, trickery, and bravery. Settlers faced unknown challenges as they streamed into Oregon country. Americans entered Texas and battled for their independence from Mexico. When gold was discovered in California, Americans sought their fortunes there. Facing persecution, Mormons also turned their sights westward. This was a time of much hope and hardship as the country expanded. So let's look at some vocabulary. We have provision, preparation. Plenipotentiary, that's a diplomat, so someone who makes agreements, who negotiates deals, usually with other countries. Trifling, insignificant. So if something is trifling, it's not important at all. Vestige, a trace, so like a little bit. Fabrication, construction. When you fabricate something, you're building something or making something. Indiscriminately, that's random. So randomly. Indiscriminately, randomly. So we're looking at primary sources. Again, these are written by people. For a primary source, these are people who experienced the event, were alive during the time period of the event. They're someone from that time period. So they're first-hand accounts of their experiences of history. So for example, right now, if we wrote down a journal, we would be giving a first-hand account or primary source of the year 2020. So primary source, diary. On the Oregon Trail. So this was written by Elizabeth Smith Geer. And let's give some background information on it. The trip west on the Oregon Trail took 5 to 6 months, with wagon trains progressing about 15 miles per day. With a sick husband and 7 children, Elizabeth Smith Geer wrote about the exhausting trip in her diary. So this gives us some background information about her. So she was traveling to on the Oregon Trail. She was traveling west. She's with her family. Her husband's sick. She has 7 children, and they're going along with the wagon trains. So here she's talking about her exhausting trip in her diary. So she's going to be describing her trip, her journey on the Oregon Trail. It rains and snows. We start this morning around the falls with our wagons. I carry my babe and lead, or rather carry, another through snow, mud, and water, almost to my knees. It is the worst road. I went ahead with my children, and I was afraid to look behind me for fear of seeing the wagons turn over into the mud. My children gave out with cold and fatigue and could not travel, and the boys had to unhitch the oxen and bring them and carry the children on to camp. I was so cold and numb, I could not tell by feeling that I had any feet at all. There was not one dry thread on one of us, not even my babe. I have not told you half we suffered. I am not adequate to the task. So we're going to analyze the text. Number 1, describing how does Geer support her point that the journey is cold and wet. So we're going to look for the words cold and wet or anything that relates to that. We see water. So she's going through snow, mud, and water. So you got that for cold. Let's see if there's anything else for cold and wet. Again, another reference to mud. My children gave out with cold and fatigue, so they couldn't walk anymore because they were so cold and tired. Fatigue is exhaustion, being really extremely tired. And anything else for cold? I was so cold and numb. So it's so cold you can't feel anything, you're numb. She couldn't even feel her feet, it was so cold. Not a dry thread on one of us. So all their threads, their clothes, they're all wet. So they're not dry at all. The opposite of dry is wet, so they're cold from rain. So how does Geer support her point that the journey is cold and wet? So we see some very specific examples of that. Citing text evidence. What mode of transportation is the family using? So we see right here with our wagons. So they're using wagons. She's carrying her child, so she's walking through almost to my knees. So you can see that she's going through all this mud and water up to almost to her knees. And again, she mentions the wagons again. The wagons appear to be mostly carrying their things. And unhitching the oxen. So the oxen were also used to help carry the wagons and the children. So generally what we get from here is that this was not an easy journey. The Oregon Trail was very difficult to travel on. And again, she's going with 7 children. She's carrying a baby in her arms, and she's carrying another one. And so this is a very, very difficult journey. So let's move on to another primary source from this time period, the Oregon Issue. James K. Polk. By the early 1840s, hundreds of American settlers were going to the Oregon country. The question of who owned Oregon, however, was not yet decided. In his first annual message in December 1845, President James K. Polk addressed America's interests in the territory. At the end of the year's notice, should Congress think it proper to make provision for giving that notice, we shall have reached a period when the national rights in Oregon must either be abandoned or firmly maintained. That they cannot be abandoned without a sacrifice of both national honor and interest is too clear to admit of doubt. Oregon is a part of the North American continent to which it is confidently affirmed the title of the United States is the best now in existence. For the grounds on which that title rests, I refer you to the correspondence of the late and present Secretary of State with the British plenipotentiary during the negotiation. The British proposition of compromise, which would make the Columbia River the line south of 49 degrees, with a trifling addition of detached territory to the United States north of that river, and would leave on the British side 2/3 of the whole Oregon territory, including the free navigation of the Columbia and all the valuable harbors on the Pacific, can never for a moment be entertained by the United States without an abandonment of their just and dear territorial rights, their own self-respect, and the national honor. For the information of Congress, I communicate herewith the correspondence which took place between the two governments during the late negotiation.